Hello, my name is Dr. Peter Lee and I'm a research fellow here at the Arson Institute for Policy Studies. And today I'll be talking about my latest issue brief, Should South Korea join AUKUS Pillar 2? I think this has very much been an important question amongst US allies in terms of burden sharing and also deeper enmeshment in what has been called the latticework of cooperation. This has really been a top agenda, I think, for the Yoon administration, but also how AUKUS countries have thought about cooperating with the Republic of Korea. So the AUKUS partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, I think, is one of the most audacious defense industrial efforts to meet the challenge of China's rising military power and particularly its naval power in the Indo-Pacific. Announced in 2021, the AUKUS partnership involves two distinct pillars, so what we generally call Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So this issue brief canvasses the question of whether South Korea should join the AUKUS Pillar 2, which is an idea that has been floated by both the AUKUS countries themselves as well as Korean interest in participation. The issue brief reviews the progress that has been made in AUKUS on both pillars over the last 3 years since its announcement. It then compares the relative cases for potential membership, looking at the case of Korea with Japan, which has also been mentioned. The issue brief then briefly touches on some of the important trade controls and defense export reforms that have gone into the AUKUS endeavor. And finally, it lays out what I categorize as 5 distinct options that Korea, but other potential partners of AUKUS could consider. And that includes what I call go hard or go early, wait and see, the plug and play model, proposing Pillar 3, and opting out. So AUKUS was announced in September 2021 by then Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, along with US President Joe Biden, and then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And it really caught the whole world by surprise. Few saw this coming, given that the US had not shared nuclear propulsion technology with another country since the United Kingdom in the late 1950s. So the first pillar of AUKUS, over the 18 months after that announcement, developed what has now been called the optimal pathway. And it sets out a phased approach for Australia to acquire a fleet of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. So the first phase of what is called Pillar 1 will involve the rotation of US and British nuclear-powered submarines through Australia to improve Australia's credibility and ability to receive nuclear propulsion technology. And so that is known as Submarine Rotational Force West, and that will begin in 2027. The second phase of Pillar 1 involves the transfer of at least 3 US Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines to Australia, commencing in the early 2030s. The final phase of Pillar 1 involves Australia and the United Kingdom respectively building their own fleet of what will be called SSN AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines. So alongside the so-called Pillar 1, the 3 countries, Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, have embarked on an audacious effort to work on cutting-edge military technologies with relevance to undersea warfare and the objectives of nuclear-powered submarines to provide long-range deterrence and strike capabilities, with a particular focus on the Indo-Pacific. So after the last 3 years of effort, Pillar 2 has come to encompass 6 specific technology streams that includes undersea capabilities, quantum technology, artificial intelligence, advanced cyber, hypersonics, electronic warfare, as well as, I guess, the enabling functions of innovation and information sharing. So this Pillar 2 endeavor really encompasses a broad range of science and technology efforts that have defense applicability, I think, and that's a really important point to emphasize. So in my view, AUKUS Pillars 1 and 2 collectively seek to increase the collective military power of the 3 countries in the Indo-Pacific Maritime Theatre to deter China's rapidly growing naval capabilities. We see this demonstrated in the very heavy defense representation in how AUKUS has been understood and developed. And so, for instance, the Department of Defense in all 3 countries has really led the design of policy documents and prescriptions for how to implement the AUKUS endeavour. Since late last year and through much of 2024, the three AUKUS countries increasingly floated and mentioned the possibility of expanding membership of Pillar 2 to include other like-minded allies and partners, with specific reference to South Korea, Japan, Canada and New Zealand. It's noteworthy that Canada and New Zealand are members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Partnership, and South Korea and Japan are two key treaty allies of the United States. At the same time, with this growing interest, and as well as expressed interest by South Korean officials over the last year or so, I think there's been a great deal of misinformation and misunderstanding about what AUKUS broadly is, and also how it applies to the Republic of Korea, at least in a lot of the Korean commentary. And so this issue brief seeks to fill that gap in knowledge. Some experts, for instance, have talked about AUKUS as a purely scientific and civilian research collaboration. Others have gone so far as to talk about it as a potential tool for balancing North Korea, as opposed to Chinese naval capabilities. And some have used it interchangeably with other regional unilateral partnerships, such as the Quad. So I think a lot of these misunderstandings around what AUKUS is stems from this lack of knowledge. I want to turn briefly to comparing, well, what actually is happening in Pillar 2 and how could countries like Japan or South Korea participate or cooperate. Really, I think the Pillar 2 progress that has been made so far is not on specific capabilities. There is some evidence on areas like intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance, on uncrewed vessels and on drones as well. But really the big effort, I think, has been on export control reform and streamlining the interoperability and interchangeability among the three countries. And so these countries, for instance, are part of what is called the National Technology and Industrial Base, to really have seamless defense industrial cooperation amongst the United States and its key allies. So I think that legislative and regulatory reform has been of great interest to officials in Japan and Korea in terms of how they can improve their own defense industrial cooperation with the United States and its partners. So in the last few months, Japan's cooperation with AUKUS has become much more formalized in terms of ministerial statements and even closer policy exchanges. At this time, we have not seen any specific deliverables or announceables in terms of Japan's participation, however. I think it's worth noting, though, that there are several differences between how Japan and Korea are already cooperating with the AUKUS countries. And so while both countries are US treaty allies and while they both host US forces, I think the nature of Japan's relationships with the United States, with the United Kingdom and Australia looks a bit more different and is much more advanced than Korea's relationships with the UK and Australia. And so we see this in things like reciprocal access agreements, reciprocal defense procurement arrangements, but also defense science and technology cooperation, and even defense procurement projects that the two countries are engaging in. So whereas Korea's relationships with Australia are currently primarily focused on land and armoured warfare capabilities, the UK, for instance, has a very robust defense industrial partnership with Japan on air force and other assets. I think for South Korean officials and South Korean experts in the coming years, the focus is less on formal membership than actually what is AUKUS trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific, and does the Republic of Korea want to be a part of that collective effort. So I think any decision to join Pillar 2 would need to take into consideration how this might affect South Korea's very ambitious defense industrial exports right now, which have been termed the K-Defense Agenda, but also Korea's long-standing interest in closer defense industrial cooperation with the United States. So for instance, even in the 23rd ROC-US Integrated Defense Dialogue that occurred this year, both sides in their joint statement mentioned that they were committed to strengthening the connection between US and ROC defense industrial bases to enhance interoperability and interchangeability within the alliance defense architecture. So I think whether or not South Korea is ultimately invited to join AUKUS, that is a matter for the AUKUS countries. Whether Korea would, how it would respond to such an invitation is what I would like to conclude this issue brief with. And so I organize the possible options around 5 key options, I think. The first is to go hard and go early. And this is a theme that I have raised in a lot of my work about Korean foreign policy, which is it often has taken a more cautious approach and often being a latecomer to a lot of these emerging unilateral partnerships. And the Quad obviously is a really good example of Korea's more cautious approach. So one option would be to go hard and go early and to join and to apply to join the AUKUS Pillar 2 partnership. And that would enable Korea to really shape the agenda, to shape the policies around AUKUS to its own advantage from the inside. The second option is to take a wait-and-see approach. And this has been applied and tried in the past, but this would really be to take a position of seeing what actual progress is made on any of the 8 streams within the Pillar 2 enterprise. So for instance, if we saw very tangible progress on advanced cyber or on hypersonics, for instance, Korea might then decide that there are tangible benefits to be had by participating. But until such point, it might take a wait-and-see approach. The third option, I think, is quite interesting, is to take a plug-and-play approach, to select specific parts of Pillar 2 that Korea stands to benefit from, other parts of Pillar 2 where Korea might contribute more. And so, for instance, Korea could join the information sharing, quantum and cyber aspects of Pillar 2, while seeking an exemption or seeking different forms of cooperation on hypersonics or undersea drones and AI, where Korea already has very significant commercial interests. One very clear example of this is that Korea could work with the AUKUS countries on a trial experiment on the P-8 Poseidon aircraft in terms of intelligence sharing and information sharing, as that was recently conducted, and because Korea is also has recently acquired its own fleet for the ROK Navy. The fourth option is what some experts in Australia have called Pillar 3, and so that is really setting aside some of this emerging technology cooperation and focusing on legacy capabilities in very high demand, such as munitions and long-range strike. So for instance, there's been enormous debate around the lack of 155 artillery shells amongst allied countries in terms of Ukraine support. There has been great interest in what Korea could contribute to that effort. The final option is what I call the opt-out clause. And that really is that if Korea has independent ambitions in some parts of its defense industrial architecture, such as, for instance, building its own nuclear-powered submarines at some future date, then it might be better to stay out of Pillar 2 and stay out of the AUKUS arrangements entirely. I think ultimately it's up to Korean officials and experts to have a robust debate around how to engage with not only the AUKUS Pillar 2 question, but the broader set of unilateral partnerships that the United States is developing, forging and expanding with its key allies and partners. Korea clearly has a role to play in all of these efforts, but I think it will depend on how this particular proposal is presented to the Korean public. So I think right now there should be greater interest in options 1, go hard and go early, or options 3, a more plug-and-play approach. I think waiting and seeing would be disadvantageous at the moment. And I think opting out would really be detrimental to Korea's interests. But having said that, I think there is great uncertainty, even amongst the AUKUS countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom, about what the next 4 years under President Trump might mean for the AUKUS endeavour. President Trump has expressed many views, but AUKUS is one that he has not expressed a very clear view one way or the other. And so I think there will be a wait-and-see approach for every country in terms of how the United States will approach defence industrial cooperation, and that's something that Korea can really help shape as well. So I hope you enjoyed the issue brief, and thank you very much.